This is part of my Rough Draft for Sunday series where I walk through my Sunday sermon in advance of it with a practice trial run and put it up on YouTube for comment. So here we go. It's very common for me to hear this complaint. How could a good God allow a world with this much suffering? This week there was the mass shooting in Florida that catches our news in the United States because it's in the United States, but that is obviously just a tiny bit of the total amount of suffering that goes on every day in this planet. Often behind this first question is a second: we could do a better job at running this world than God, which I often find to be a very ironic comment, since in fact, to a great degree, we seem to be running this world. It's human beings making decisions about politics and economics and households and churches and just about every other institution under the sun. This week in The Spectator, I caught a very interesting article on, does aid do more harm than good? And I hadn't heard anything about this Oxfam scandal. Apparently, what a scandal for our time. Oxfam, the upholder of modern-day virtue, unassailable in its righteousness, buried for 7 years that it hid workers exploiting young girls. The men abused their power to have sex with desperate victims of the Haiti earthquake, the very people they were supposed to protect. Michelle Russell of the Charity Commission is clear about the deception. We were categorically told by Oxfam there were no allegations of abuse of beneficiaries. We are very angry and cross about this. Now what we see in a sense are two sides of human depravity. On one hand, most of us are not surprised that individuals succumb. So what we tend to do in order to put individuals in check, we establish systems and institutions, and those are designed to protect us from the outrages of individuals. But here, the institutions failed too. The article goes on to point out that these are feel-good industries for the affluent guilt of wealthy nations. But there are a host of unintended consequences from Oxfam and other organizations. These organizations have undermined and corrupted governments. They've undermined local economy. There's a vivid description of how in some places food distribution has led to prostitution in places where there had been no prostitution. And villagers are afraid to complain because they're afraid that the aid might be withdrawn. Dambisa Moyo, a global economist from Zambia, points out the first world has sent more than $1 trillion to Africa over the past 50 years. Far from ending extreme poverty, this fabulous sum promoted it. Between 1970 and 1998, when aid flows to Africa were at their peak, poverty in Africa rose from 11% to a staggering 66%. Of course, there were other factors, but in her book, Dead Aid, Moyo states, aid has been and continues to be an unmitigated political, economic, and humanitarian disaster for most parts of the developing world. Indeed, the more development aid a country receives, the less likely it is to enjoy economic success. In 1957, Ghana boasted a higher per capita GDP than South Korea. 30 years later, it was lower by a factor of 10. The toxic effect of official development aid being one factor. On the other hand, South Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia, the recipients of very little aid, flourished. Aid distorts home markets. Food aid, for example, causes agricultural sector to shrink and makes famine more likely than less likely. As Moyo points out, in no other sector, business or politics, are such proven failures allowed to persist in the face of stark and unassailable evidence. Wow. So what should you do about that? Should we just stop trying to help the poor? Is that the answer? I think what we have to derive from this is that we don't know, but if it raises a question about anything, it raises a question about our competence and our ability to know what's going on and to, in fact, address the suffering of this world. Well, I want to begin the story back where the story begins in the book of Genesis. One God creates by speaking good order into chaos. A good world and a good story begins. A man and woman are made in his image and are given authority to rule over the creation as the Creator's stewards. The man and the woman, at the suggestion of the serpent, rebel, distrusting their Maker's good intention. Distrust spreads between the man and the woman and the serpent, and it is ironic that the distrust began by trusting the serpent over their Maker. The man and the woman were exiled from the garden. The man would now fight the earth instead of being the steward over it, to wrest from it food to survive. The woman would fight her body to wrest from it a future through children. The man and the woman could no longer see their Maker face to face, where, in a sense, before then, the idea is that by eating the fruit of the tree, they would know good and evil. Now they know good and evil. Now they can't see their Creator. They are too much like Him to not see Him without comparing themselves to Him, which would crush them. And then the story continues. One of the things I like to point out is that there's no altar in the Garden of Eden because heaven and earth are not separated. Heaven and earth is one. The garden is the royal garden of the palace temple where the Maker lives. And the man and the woman could not access the heavens. Heaven and earth are divorced in the rebellion with the exile from the garden. So the man and the woman could no longer access the heavens, which controlled the earth, which will, of course, later lead to the Tower of Babel. The sons of the parents try to reconnect with God through sacrifices. And, in fact, it's over sacrifices that Cain slew his brother Abel when his sacrifice was not received. And then in Genesis chapter 4 and 5, development continues. The rebellion in the parents leads to murder between the sons. The children develop technology and power, and the gift of image bearing endures, but in an uneven and twisted way. They continue to be stewards over the world, but the way they use their power and what they do with it leads to all kinds of sometimes intended evil and sometimes unintended evil consequences. Genesis 6. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. So, you want God to end the suffering in the world? Here's one way. But Noah found favor in the eyes of God. Where's this going to go? This is the account of Noah and his family. This is part of the Toledot structure throughout the book of Genesis. And you can find it repeated again and again throughout the book. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the peoples of the earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So God made him, so make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. And then he gives instructions. But what's interesting here is that divine rescue here means boat building made by the man. God didn't create like a wall of protection like he parted the Red Sea where Noah and his family and the animals could live in their house. God doesn't say to get up on top of a mountain where the waters won't reach. God commands him to build a boat. And obviously, Noah is going to have to fulfill that command. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. And again, you notice the basic orientations of heaven and earth. And this is consistent throughout the Bible. It's something that we as modern readers often pay absolutely no attention to. I'm going to destroy the floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has breath in it, everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Now, what's interesting here is that this is the first use of this word in the Bible, this covenant word. The word wasn't an unusual word. All of the readers of Genesis would have understood exactly what covenant is. Covenant is an agreement. Covenant is often a relationship between a superior and an inferior. Sometimes covenants are relationships between equals, but in the ancient world there are hardly ever any equals. Someone is always at one position on the pecking order or the other. And so covenants are agreements, and they administer a relationship. They aren't the relationship itself. They administer the relationship. And what's interesting here is that God lets Noah in on his plan. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you and be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and stored away as food for you and for them. And Noah did everything just as God commanded him. And this basically is a reiteration of Moses' righteousness. But now what's about to follow, which shouldn't be overly separated because of the chapter break. Chapter breaks come far later in your Bible than was originally written. Seems like, again, one of these strange repetitions that we so often find in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament for that matter, but not as often. And originally, a lot of these repetitions were seen as sloppy redactions, that there were these documents behind the text, which there likely were, and that somehow sloppy editors kind of mashed them together, and that's why we get these repetitions. Actually, a lot of better biblical scholarship in the last 50 years has been able to demonstrate that these, in fact, aren't sloppy redactions, but these are intentional literary devices in order for us to illuminate and to see what is in the mind of the author. And in fact, what we're going to look for are differences in the repetition, and it's just like a story of Goldilocks, where you have repetition in the story and then you have differences, and what the repetition affords is the illumination of the differences. You notice the differences because of the repetition. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found righteousness I have found you righteous in this generation." And again, we think, well, we just already said this. Why is the author repeating this? "Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth, and for 40 days and nights I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made." And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. But now pay attention, we have the inclusion of, make sure with the pairs you have male and female. Now, this should have been obvious, but now it's illuminated. And the strangest thing, we also see the repetitions of 7 and the repetitions of 40. These will be standard things that get written in fact, to the story of the Bible. You find lots of 7s. We saw 7 days in the beginning of Genesis. We'll see the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years. We'll see Jesus tempted for 40 days. And so these become manners of communicating in the biblical language. But now what's really interesting here at the beginning of chapter 7 is the entrance of clean and unclean. And if you're familiar with the Bible, you know that when we get to Moses and the covenant given in the desert, there'll be a lot going on with this clean and unclean. And this clean and unclean will persist. And what's interesting is that here we find it popping in to the Noah narrative. And we might ask, why? So you're going to save 2 of all the unclean animals, but 7 pairs of the clean animals. Why? And well, obviously, in the frame of the story here, Noah should have understood what clean and unclean were, even though we don't have those commands given until far later. So obviously something is going on in this story. Now, what follows after this, I'm just skipping through the chapter because there's a lot of material, and in the interest of time, then you do have the flood, and they're on the ark, and the world is drowned, and they're on the boat. And then chapter 8 begins, but God remembered Noah. And as we're going to see a little bit later, this phrase doesn't mean that God is somehow absent-minded and he's, watching other planets and he's, playing cards with the Trinity and things like this. And, oh yeah, Noah. No, this word remembering is actually a covenant word. It is a word where someone remembers their promise, which means they fulfill their promise. They in a sense are holding, the promise is holding them accountable. The covenant is holding God accountable, which leads us to the question of, why did he make a covenant anyway? He didn't need to make a covenant here. He didn't need to involve Noah. He could have certainly arranged things that Noah perhaps was on top of a mountain and then God sent all the animals there and Noah found himself saved. No, you have to build this boat. You have to work in collaboration with me. And here now God remembers his promise to Noah. And actually, if you look at the structure of the story, this sits exactly at the center of the structure of the story of Noah. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him on the ark. Now notice again the separation of the wild animals, which are not domesticatable, and the then livestock, who are the domesticated animals. And these, we don't have the differentiation quite of clean and unclean here, but there's another differentiation going on here, and so we're bringing into the foreground both the wildness of the world and, in a sense, man's carving out of the world in terms of his domestication, and God preserving all of that, because even though my little coloring perhaps obscured this, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living animal that was with you, the birds, the animals, all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply in the earth and be fruitful and increase in number in it." Now this is a direct repetition of the commands in Genesis 1, but there was no talk of a covenant there. So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all of the animals and all of the creatures that move along the ground, and all of the birds and everything that moves on the land came out of the ark, one kind after another. But now again, notice the repetition and the structure within the repetition. Then Noah built an altar. An altar. Heaven and earth are still separated. God, in a sense, has just drowned the world, and now he's building an altar. He is reconnecting with God through an altar, which is the way that you connect with God at that time and space in the world. Now, we contemporary people would probably think, well, he could just pray, or he could just talk, or no, he built an altar. And then what does he do? He's taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, and he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. And we might at this point say, now wait a minute. You went through all that trouble to save these critters, and the minute you get off, you sacrifice them? Is that really a good idea? What if some of the animals get sick? This is a poor economy. But obviously not to Noah. Noah thinks this is, in fact, the best thing he can do, and perhaps the only thing he should do in terms of everything that has happened. And I think in this moment we see the great distance between Noah and ourselves, little pragmatists that we are. Well, I should probably be fair to the pragmatists and say that for Noah, this was an extremely pragmatic thing. This was, in fact, as vital to Noah as building a shelter or beginning to cultivate the field, which Noah will do because he was a man of the earth. We're not going to get into that aspect of the story, but this is what you do. But notice you only sacrifice the clean animals. What does that mean? Because the clean animals are a category apart. They are, in a sense, holy. They are, in a sense, acceptable to God. And then later, if you get into are trying to discern, and we even today continue to try to discern what was behind this clean and unclean, it often seems to be a category of order rather than confusion. It seems to be a category of, in terms of the cultural framework, that these particular animals, and again, the Mosaic Law gets into chewing of the cud and hooves, and crustaceans were not clean, lobsters were not clean because they lived in the sea, but they didn't have scales and swim. And so they're a category confusion, so they're unclean. But fish are clean. And so sheep and goats are clean, pigs are unclean. And it's pretty much discredited that these were medical differentiations. These are, in fact, category differentiations because in some ways these animals are in order. They're sorted. They in a sense follow proper categories within the cultural framework of the audience. And so only these animals are sacrificed. And God blessed Noah and his sons, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and increase in number. The fear and the dread of all will fall on you, all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky and every creature that moves along the ground and on all the fish in the sea, and they are given into your hands." This is dominion from Genesis 1 and 2. "Everything that lives and moves will be food for you." This is new. "Just as I gave you green plants, I now give you everything." But notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, "I give you the clean animals to eat." He says, "You can eat anything." But while we're making covenant, aren't you giving rules? Yes, you are. "But you must not eat meat that has lifeblood in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an account. I will demand an account from every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an account for the lifeblood of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God, God made mankind." Now we have reverence to the animals by not eating the lifeblood in them, but we also have human privilege coming in. And this is obviously in direct response to the violence that was before the flood. "As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it." So the command given to the animals is the command given to humanity to be fruitful and multiply, and this is the command re-given from Genesis 1. Now, then God said to Noah and his sons with him, "I now establish my covenant with you." Back to this covenant language. "And with your descendants after you." "And every living creature that was with you, the birds and the livestock and all the animals and all those who came out of the ark with you, every living thing upon the earth." And now perhaps we're getting a sense of why it was the man and the animals. It was the animals that took the hit for the man's decision. And so in this passage, we see a differentiation between the man and the animals. But the man, the steward by creation, was in a sense responsible for the animals. And so therefore the animals took the hit when their leader was responsible, not unlike in a nation when a president or a king makes a decision to perhaps go to war with another nation. All the people of the nation suffer. Well, humanity are the stewards of the earth. So when the stewards choose wisely, those beneath him flourishes. But when the steward chooses poorly, everyone beneath suffers. "I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the whole earth." Now again, we as modern people hear this just as, in a sense, any old flood And God said, this is the sign of the covenant between me and you and every living generation, every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember. Covenant language. Remember how he remembered Noah? When he sees the rainbow, he'll remember. I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Now, again, for most of us, this connection is lost. But for an ancient person in this milieu, well, what is the rainbow? The rainbow is making the firmament, this dome, visible. And it reminds them, and God, it reminds as well, that I will maintain the firmament. I won't pierce it and bring the cosmic waters above down upon the earth to flood it, to bring chaos back into the earth that wipes out humanity. I will preserve the firmament. I will uphold the firmament that keeps back the cosmic waters. And so when you see it rain, fear not. When you see the rainbow, I will remember my covenant, just like I remembered Noah. This is the sign of the covenant I have established between you and me and all the earth. But here's the question that we begin with. Why collaborate with us? Implicit in the "if there is a good God" protest is that this God should do something by himself. And we think about this often. But yet we don't think through what should be done. Well, what would you have God do for us? Would you have God make every gun pointed against a human being misfire? Would you have God make every knife that is pointed at a human being turn to butter? What about the looks? What about the incautious words? What about all of the ways that we hurt each other? How would you have God protect us from each other and ourselves? Now, God did the flood by himself, and we can certainly object to that, but he collaborated with Noah. Noah had to build the ark, and then we have the beginning of all this covenant language, and a covenant sign, and well, what does all of this mean? And then we have the meat eating, which gets really strange, because the covenant comes with rules. You cannot eat animals with the lifeblood in, because the lifeblood begins to God. And you cannot kill other human beings. Now, you may eat the animals, but here are the stipulations. But God didn't outlaw eating unclean animals. And that's really interesting. Because when we get to the whole clean and unclean animals thing, when we get to Israel, it seems to be an anachronism. And what's interesting, though, is that Israel may only eat clean animals. Well, then what is the role of Israel with respect to the role of Noah and all of the descendants of Noah? You see, Israel seems to be elected to be a sacrifice. Notice in Noah's story how the clean animals are sacrificed and not the unclean. And now, of course, anybody who knows the Mosaic sacramental system would say, of course, only the clean animals are sacrificed, not the unclean. It would be an abomination to sacrifice an unclean animal. But what does that say about Israel? Because Israel is supposed to be clean. And the entire Mosaic law is about Israel maintaining its cleanliness. So what does that make Israel? It makes Israel a sacrifice. The Lord tells Israel they are to be a nation of priests. The whole nation is held to a higher standard. They too, however, will fail the covenant, just like all the children of Noah. But God keeps his covenant. God remembers his covenant. And what is it like to keep a bargain, to keep an agreement, when the other side caves and caves repeatedly? Right away we have in this first covenant that is named in the Bible as a covenant, a relationship in which God enters into with us, knowing full well what a bad bet we are. Noah is the best man you can find in the world, and it will still go horribly wrong. So maybe the original question we ask, how could God allow such a thing? Maybe what we should ask if we were God's counselors is to say, why didn't you just kill Noah and be done with them? Why bother allowing this to continue? And especially, why bother involving these people who are just such a bad risk? If we were given a moral credit score, humanity score would have had to be 0. Because we are a bad bet. And we blame God for not unilaterally eliminating evil without considering what it would be to eliminate much of what we want in our entire existence. We want God to fix evil, but we don't want God to stop the kinds of evil we do. Or we don't want God to judge the kinds of decisions we make about good, bad, right, and wrong. In fact, we have our judgments about good, bad, right, and wrong that we challenge God with and basically say, we'd like to be in charge and we'd like you to leave us alone. So right there we have the paradox, where on one hand we want to blame God and on the other for not interfering, and on the other hand we want God to stay out of our business. And that's exactly how we are. Yet he comes down to covenant with us. And again, what sense does this make? Why covenant with us? We tell God we could run things better, but how much of human misery isn't just about preying on each other? See, we don't trust each other, and we don't trust God. In the words of the Heidelberg Catechism, we have a natural tendency to hate God and our neighbor. But God did not have to spare Noah, but he did. He did not have to spare the world, but he does. Now, maybe you don't believe in the Bible and you don't believe in any of this story business, and that's okay. But consider for a moment how many habitable planets we know and the kind of cosmic events that we have. And most of us know that, a meteor or an asteroid could destroy life on the world. Now that might not be waters from above, but in a sense, an asteroid would be chaos from above and make the planet inhabitable. Yet here we are. What about that? God did not have to spare Noah. Noah was in many ways the flaw in his plan of washing away the sins of the world. Israel was elected as a sacrifice, in a sense, a clean animal. Once you start talking election, you start first talking about Israel's election and then Jesus' election. Jesus was elected as a sacrifice, a spotless lamb. God chooses to collaborate not because we are such good partners, but because in our hearts, it is our hearts that need saving, not just our deeds. So, what does that mean for us? You are the beneficiary of a covenant. Life goes on. We're still here. We haven't been drowned out. We haven't been smitten by an asteroid. Most of the threats we feel about life in the earth are self-imposed by us. There's a lot of questions. If we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere, will the ice caps melt? Will we drown a lot of our cities now? Well, that won't be God drowning us from above. That'll be us drowning us from below. What the Christian gospel says is that your sins have been paid for. Is that Jesus was the sacrifice. He was the clean sacrifice. Someone else paid for the sacrifice required of you with his blood. And then the question is, if you believe this, how will you respond? And that's where covenant comes back in. Will you keep breaking the covenant? Because, again, an advisor would say to God, now don't make an agreement with these people. They are we keep credit scores because we try to figure out who will and won't pay their debts. Humanity is not a good risk. Humanity is, in fact, a bad risk. And even Noah, who obeyed the Lord and built the ark, later on would bring all kinds of things. And the children of Noah would build the Tower of Babel. And off we would go again, and God would add a new chapter to this story through Abraham. And we'll get to those covenants as we go through the series. But what about us? will we keep breaking the covenant? Well, you might say, well, I don't even know what the covenants are. Well, that might be worthwhile looking into. Will you, out of joy and gratitude, freely fulfill it? In other words, what's interesting here about the story is that God didn't come to Noah and say, no, if you're really, really good, I'll save you. In fact, God just came to Noah and said, I'm going to save you, and I'm going to save your family, and I'm going to use you to save the animals, and I want you to do some things. In fact, I need you to do some things, but this is how it's going to work. And he makes a covenant. And then he makes a covenant with the creation and says, I am going to tolerate you. I am going to look down and I am going to see your misery. I am going to see workers from Oxfam with the money from England given to help the poor people of Haiti who have suffered yet another devastation go and see those gifts be used to incite prostitution amongst girls from villages. I'm going to watch this. I'm going to watch school shootings in Florida. I'm going to watch the little cruelties done in every human household between spouses, between parents and children. I'm going to watch the wars between nations. I'm going to watch all of this, and I'm going to tolerate it. And I'm going to make a covenant with you. And I'm going to set in motion a series of events. I'm going to set into motion a sacrifice. And because you can't come up with the best sacrifices, because your sacrifices are insufficient even to save yourself, I am going to offer a sacrifice on your behalf and rescue you. Will you again, covenant breakers, enter into covenant with me? Will you do it freely? Will you do it joyfully? Will you do what I ask?